cop refuses to let black woman speak in court. Then she stands up as the judge. In a packed courtroom buzzing with anticipation, all eyes fell on a single moment of tense confrontation. A towering police officer, face etched with rigid determination, refused to hand over the microphone to a calm yet unyielding black woman about to speak in her own defense. Whispers rippled through the gallery. This was no ordinary hearing, and she was no ordinary defendant. Disbelief turned to shock when, in an electrifying twist, the woman stood up as the newly appointed judge. The room froze, hearts pounded, and reputations teetered on the brink. No one realized that a dramatic reckoning was about to shake the foundations of justice itself. The city of Houston had always been a labyrinth of stories, a place where grand successes and colossal failures lived side by side. It was here, in the bustling heart of downtown, that the Harris County Criminal Justice Center towered its pale stone facade and imposing columns hinting at the gravity of the decisions made within. Every day, judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officials walked the halls, carrying with them the weight of justice. Some approached with reverence, others with resentment, but all recognized this building as a stage for life-altering events. On a sweltering Texas afternoon, a young black woman named Regina Monroe stepped onto the marble floors of the main foyer. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, her glossy black pumps clicked with each determined step. She nodded politely to a few colleagues, attorneys who offered tight smiles of acknowledgement. Most did not realize the magnitude of her presence or the new role she was about to undertake. Her swearing-in ceremony as the newest judge was to be held in private chambers the following day, and while a handful of insiders knew to the rest, she was merely another attorney weaving through the corridors of justice. Regina had chosen this city with deliberate care. She'd grown up in a small Louisiana town where opportunities were scarce and prejudices were all too commonplace. She had witnessed numerous injustices, neighbors arrested on dubious charges, families torn apart by systemic biases. Empowered by these experiences, she pursued a law degree at Howard University, immersing herself in a culture of excellence and resilience. The dream was always to return to the South, but with the power and influence to make tangible changes. As she walked through the courthouse, memories of her trials and tribulations flitted through her mind like a slideshow. For Regina, the path to becoming a judge was anything but smooth. There had been doubters, professors who suggested she tone down her ambition, classmates who questioned her capacity to handle the rigors of the judiciary, and even members of her own extended family who believed a young black woman would never be allowed a seat on the bench. But Regina's determination had been forged in adversity. Her resolve manifested in long study sessions, volunteer work at legal clinics, and deep involvement in civil rights organizations. Over time, her reputation for fair-mindedness and unyielding advocacy grew, catching the attention of colleagues in higher places. The appointment to the bench had come swiftly. Judge Anton Delgado, a seasoned official well-respected for his integrity, had announced his retirement after a decades-long career. Regina's name rose quickly through the ranks of possible successors. She was known to be tough, but even-handed, compassionate but not easily manipulated, and resolute in the face of intimidation. The governor's office, eager to signal a new era of progress, officially endorsed her. Within months, the city and its legal community were abuzz with talk of the new judge who would bring a fresh perspective to the Harris County courts. But not everyone greeted this development with open arms. Whispered rumors circulated about resentful officers, skeptical attorneys, and even older judges who found her meteoric rise unsettling. In the corners of conference rooms, some snickered at her youth, while others questioned her lack of proper connections. Such tensions brewed beneath the veneer of professionalism that cloaked the courthouse. Regina, fully aware of these murmurs, walked on resolutely, each footstep a quiet statement of her willingness to stand face to face with any opposition. On that particular afternoon, just a day before the ceremony, Regina visited the vacant courtroom that would become her own. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, highlighting rows of empty benches. The scent of polished wood and aged books hung in the air. She stood behind the judge's bench, resting her hands lightly on the mahogany surface, allowing the moment to sink in. There was a certain reverence in her posture. The bench wasn't merely a piece of furniture to her, it was a symbol of the justice she hoped to uphold. Little did she know that the very next day, the stage would be set for one of the most explosive confrontations the Harris County Criminal Justice Center had ever witnessed. A confrontation sparked by deep-seated prejudice and ignorance, and fueled by a system that often found itself at war with the very principles it claimed to uphold. As she left the courtroom, Regina spotted an older white male officer glaring at her from across the hall. His eyes seemed to flicker with a blend of confusion and hostility. She'd done nothing to him, but in that tense moment it was evident that something unspoken was being exchanged. Ignoring his glare, Regina continued on her way. Her heart pounded, not in fear, but in a potent mix of anticipation and ironclad resolve. She whispered a silent prayer. "May justice and fairness guide me. May I have the strength to stand unwavering in the face of injustice." Officer Brady Halston had spent 20 years on the force, patrolling neighborhoods from the wealthiest enclaves to the most troubled streets of Houston. He had climbed the ranks slowly, eventually transitioning from street patrol to courthouse duty, a position many assumed was meant for those nearing retirement or seeking a less physically strenuous role. But Brady was a man whose pride and self-worth were wrapped tightly in the badge he carried. He wasn't fond of stepping aside or fading into the background. While he wore the uniform of the Houston Police Department, he remained vigilant, quick to anger, and deeply protective of a certain order he believed must be maintained at all costs. For Officer Halston, that order often crossed into personal bias. He viewed himself as the gatekeeper of who deserved to be heard and who did not. Much of this worldview stemmed from early personal experiences. He had once been assaulted by a suspect who happened to be black, and though he would never admit it openly, the trauma left a stain on his perceptions. Over time, that single event mutated into a broad prejudice, entangling his sense of justice with fear and resentment. It was the silent undercurrent that shaped his interactions in the courthouse, though few dared to call him out on it. His colleagues had long learned to tolerate him or keep a distance. He was known for his stern approach, glaring at defendants, rarely smiling in public, and shooting suspicious glances at any perceived threat to his authority. He had forcibly removed more than a few individuals from court proceedings for contempt, sometimes justifiably, sometimes not. Still, superiors rarely intervened, and he had never been formally reprimanded for any wrongdoing. Such was the courthouse culture, hierarchical and protective of its own, especially if it meant preserving the illusion of disciplined order. The day before Regina's swearing in, Brady had heard rumors about another diversity hire, as he crudely put it. Word drifted through the break room that the new judge was young, idealistic, and black. The pieces of gossip had him seething privately. He concealed his contempt, but inside it festered like an infected wound. While some welcomed new energy on the bench, Brady saw only trouble. He had faced plenty of attorneys who, in his eyes, cared more about progressive agendas than law and order. Placing one of them behind the bench, with the power to overrule him, grated at his pride. That same afternoon, he caught a glimpse of Regina Monroe as she inspected her future courtroom. He stood at the end of the corridor, arms crossed over his chest, shooting a hard-eyed stare in her direction. She didn't flinch, she simply moved on, as though unimpressed by his presence. The rational part of his mind told him this woman had never done him harm, that any hostility he felt toward her was baseless. But old resentments had carved a deep groove in his heart. Her composure angered him further. He told himself it was arrogance, though a more introspective man might have recognized envy. He spent that evening in a state of restless tension. At home, he paced his living room, ignoring his wife's concerned questions. He nursed a drink, flipping channels, but not really watching. The next day, he would be on duty at the courthouse. He knew from the schedule that Judge Delgado's retirement ceremony and the new judge's swearing-in would take place. Sure enough, Regina Monroe would then preside over preliminary hearings in Delgado's old courtroom. She would be on the bench, and Brady would be stationed at the door, controlling who entered or left. The prospect made his jaw clench. As he finally settled into bed, unsettling dreams prowled through his mind, scenes where he was humiliated by a crowd or stripped of his authority. Within these visions, a female figure loomed, robed in black, banging a gavel. It wasn't exactly Regina's face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. He woke in a cold sweat. With no one to confide in, and with his own pride blocking any introspection, Brady steeled himself for the day ahead, convinced that if any situation demanded a show of authority, he would not hesitate to provide it. Morning came swiftly, the Texas sun already blazing. Brady donned his uniform, pinned on his badge, and stepped out the door. The drive to the Harris County Criminal Justice Center was filled with silent brooding. As he parked in his usual spot, the building's facade loomed like a fortress, and for a moment he felt an undercurrent of dread. Then, with a clenched jaw, he brushed it off and reminded himself he was the law, or so he liked to think. Little did he know that within hours his concept of power and authority would be challenged in the most public, most humiliating way possible. Early the next morning, a modest gathering of colleagues, a few family members, and close friends convened in Judge Delgado's chambers for Regina's swearing-in. The room smelled of fresh coffee and pastries, courtesy of a local bakery in Midtown Houston. Warm smiles, soft chatter, and the occasional laughter gave the cramped space an aura of celebration. The Houston Chronicle had even sent a junior reporter to cover the event, signifying the local interest in this changing of the guard. Regina stood at the center of the room, hands folded in front of her, maintaining her poised posture. She wore a simple black robe, and despite her best efforts to appear serene, her eyes betrayed the swirl of emotions beneath. Pride, nerves, and a solemn sense of duty all collided in her mind. She caught her mother's teary gaze, an expression that was simultaneously proud and overwhelmed. Regina's father, stoic by nature, nodded his silent approval from across the room. This was a moment the entire Monroe family had envisioned for years, a testament to perseverance and faith. Judge Delgado, silver-haired and dignified, cleared his throat, drawing the attendees' attention. With a trembling voice, emotional from passing the torch, he began the official swearing-in. Regina repeated the oath, each word punctuated by her unwavering conviction. I, Regina Monroe, do solemnly swear that I will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me as judge of the House. With those words, a quiet hush fell across the room. A wave of applause and congratulations followed. Cameras flashed and hugs were exchanged. Judge Delgado introduced her to well-wishers as the bright new future of our judicial system, a phrase that elicited proud handshakes and beaming smiles. Outside in the hallway, however, tension simmered. Officer Brady Halston glowered from his post near the entrance. He watched as people trickled out of Delgado's office, congratulating Regina with broad smiles. The unspoken narrative in Halston's mind was that this was yet another orchestrated push to upend the system he believed in. Though no one had said anything outwardly inflammatory, he interpreted their joy as an attack on his sense of order. When the small crowd dissipated and Regina finally emerged, robe in hand, Halston locked eyes with her for a split second. She gave him a courteous nod, but he offered no response. Later that morning, the official schedule showed that Regina would preside over preliminary hearings in courtroom 4B, the same place she had visited the day before. Judge Delgado would appear one last time, partly to observe her first official session and partly to wrap up any loose ends before retirement. Word spread quickly, and though the docket contained mostly routine matters arraignments, bail hearings, scheduling a few extra onlookers gathered out of curiosity. Court staff, attorneys, and interns filled the benches, eager to witness the first moments of Houston's newest judge in action. Regina was escorted to her chambers, preparing for the session. She took a few minutes to gather her notes, steady her breath, and say a silent prayer. Then, calmly, she entered the courtroom through a side door, ascended the dais, and settled into the high-backed judge's chair. The courtroom, already buzzing, fell into immediate silence at her presence. She pressed a button on her microphone, and her voice echoed with gentle authority. "Good morning, everyone. The court is now in session." From his position near the front, Officer Halston observed her every move. A faint sneer tugged at his lips. Could this young woman truly command the authority of a judge? He intended to find out. The first few cases progressed smoothly. Regina addressed each matter with a level of clarity and empathy rarely seen from a new judge. She asked pointed, thoughtful questions, ensuring the defendants understood their rights. She engaged the prosecutors and defense attorneys with an air of mutual respect. Judge Delgado, seated quietly at a side bench, watched with a faint smile, occasionally nodding in approval. Even the most jaded observers in the courtroom sensed a shift in atmosphere, as though a more humane but steadfast approach to justice had arrived. But then came the moment that would mar this promising start. On the docket was a hearing for a woman named Tanya Rogers, a mother of two facing misdemeanor charges. She stood at the defendant's podium, her posture nervous but determined. Regina motioned for her to speak, wanting to hear her side before deciding bail. That was when Officer Halston intervened. In a swift motion, he stepped forward and blocked Tanya from moving closer to the microphone. The room went silent. Regina's eyes narrowed slightly. "Officer," she addressed him politely, "please allow Miss Rogers to speak. I need to hear her statement." The officer hesitated, his posture defiant. Tanya tried to lean toward the mic, but Halston gripped the stand, preventing it from tilting her way. It was an unprecedented display of disrespect in open court, and gasps echoed from the gallery. Judge Delgado furrowed his brow, leaning forward in concern. Regina's hand tightened on her gavel. A ripple of tension shot through the room. People wondered if this was a misunderstanding or a blatant act of insubordination. Halston glared at Regina, as if waiting for a reaction. Outside, in the corridors, murmurs of confusion signaled that others had noticed something amiss. In that heartbeat of silence, the entire courtroom realized that something bigger than a routine hearing was about to unfold, a clash that would test the mettle of a newly appointed judge and the depths of prejudice hidden within these hallowed walls. Regina took a measured breath, attempting to maintain composure. She'd trained herself to remain calm under pressure, but this was a new dimension of challenge. A uniformed officer was blatantly interfering with due process in her courtroom. The gallery watched, eyes wide, as she began to speak. "Officer Halston," she said firmly, "the defendant has the right to address this court. Stand down, please." Halston lingered, his rigid stance refusing to budge. Tanya Rogers, eyes darting between Halston and Regina, looked confused and frightened. The tension grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Delgado rose to his feet, prepared to intervene, but Regina held up a hand, signaling she would handle it. "You heard the judge, officer," Delgado added softly, hoping Halston would recognize the seriousness of the command. But Halston was fixated on Regina alone. Brady Halston's internal fury manifested in a glare that could have melted steel. "Your Honor," he spat out, the words dripping with sarcasm, "I'm only doing my duty, keeping order." Anger flickered across Regina's eyes, but she refused to let it control her. "You are obstructing the legal proceedings of this court. That is not your duty." Her voice was calm yet unwavering. "For the final time, step back." A hush fell over the gallery, as though everyone collectively held their breath. Most had never seen anything like this before. Even seasoned attorneys squirmed uncomfortably. A bailiff by the door exchanged glances with a court clerk, both unsure how to proceed without a direct order. Halston stared down Tanya Rogers, who stood trembling next to him. Then he turned his gaze back to Regina. "You can't run this place however you want," he muttered, the disdain in his tone unmistakable. That single sentence snapped the tension. Regina lightly tapped her gavel once, twice, the sharp sound reverberating in the silence. "Officer Halston," she said with authority, "you are hereby in contempt of court." "Bailiff, please escort Officer Halston out of this courtroom." A chorus of shocked murmurs erupted. Halston had just been removed from his post by a judge's direct order, an explosive scenario, especially on Regina's first official day. The bailiff, wide-eyed but obligated to follow, approached Halston, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Halston tensed, but he saw that ignoring this command could lead to even harsher consequences. For a moment, it seemed Halston might resist physically, but then he exhaled a bitter breath of frustration and marched toward the exit. As he left, he shot Regina a venomous look, a silent promise that this wasn't over. Regina met his gaze head-on, refusing to waver or show fear. The moment the door closed behind him, an almost audible release of tension swept the courtroom. Several lawyers whispered to each other, others scribbled notes in disbelief, and the handful of media present furiously typed on laptops. Judge Delgado stood, stepping to Regina's side, his expression both supportive and concerned. Regina gave him a subtle nod, then leaned into her microphone. "Miss Rogers," she said, her voice resolute but gentle, "you may now speak." Tanya swallowed hard, glanced at the judge, and began her story. She had been arrested for allegedly stealing groceries, but she insisted she had receipts for everything. She also mentioned that the arresting officer never bothered to look at her proof. Regina listened intently, eyes locked on Tanya, ensuring the defendant felt seen and heard. It was a small act of compassion, a stark contrast to the tension that had just torn through the room. Once Tanya finished, Regina requested the evidence and scheduled a full hearing in a week's time, releasing Tanya on her own recognizance in the interim. After that, Regina addressed the docket's remaining cases with calm efficiency, but everyone's minds were still fixated on the earlier altercation. The swirling emotions, anger, relief, admiration, colored each subsequent interaction. By the time the session ended, the story had spread like wildfire throughout the courthouse. People whispered about how a new judge, on her first day, had found herself pitted against a long-serving officer notorious for his rigid and sometimes biased behavior. Judge Delgado quietly guided Regina into her chambers afterward. He offered a few words of reassurance, telling her that the law was on her side and that Halston's blatant disrespect simply forced her hand. She appreciated the support, but she also felt a heaviness in her chest. She knew that while the immediate situation was resolved, the fallout was just beginning. Indeed, on the other side of the courthouse walls, Officer Halston fumed. He had been taken to a supervisor's office where he was asked to explain his actions. His face burned with humiliation. Never before had he been disciplined in such a public manner, especially not by someone he viewed with suspicion and prejudice. He fumbled for justifications, claiming Regina was overstepping, that he was only following procedure. But even his fellow officers seemed unconvinced. As the day wore on, rumors swirled. Some praised Regina for standing her ground. Others muttered that she was too headstrong, perhaps not understanding the traditional ways the system operated. Meanwhile, an official complaint was filed, which meant the courthouse administration would have to conduct a review. The stakes were high. Halston's career hung in the balance, and Regina's newly minted authority would be scrutinized for any possible flaw. Unbeknownst to them both, the collision course they had embarked upon was not yet done. The real storm was still forming, one that would leave neither party unscathed, and the entire legal community in turmoil. In the days that followed, every corridor conversation at the Harris County Criminal Justice Center seemed to circle back to Judge Regina Monroe and Officer Brady Halston. Gossips and onlookers alike found themselves enthralled by the spectacle of a veteran officer being held in contempt by a newly sworn-in judge. Some saw it as a necessary reckoning, long overdue. Others believed it was an unfortunate clash of personalities and a sign of friction to come. Regina did her best to go about her duties without letting the incident overshadow her work. She spent long hours in her chambers, poring over files and preparing for upcoming cases. Defense attorneys and prosecutors who appeared before her found her fair but unyielding in her adherence to the law. Even so, the presence of tension was palpable. Bailiffs and court staff whispered their admiration in hushed tones, relieved that someone had finally stood up to Halston's bullying, yet they also worried about repercussions. Halston had allies in the system, people who viewed him as a dedicated officer who took no nonsense. In a dimly lit bar a few blocks from the courthouse, Halston nursed a whiskey sour one evening, replaying the moment of his humiliation over and over. Each time he imagined the sight of Regina calmly ordering his removal, his teeth clenched tighter. He blamed her for tarnishing his reputation. He blamed the system for putting her in a position of power. His bitterness fermented into dangerous resolve. He wasn't going to let a rookie judge tarnish his career. The next morning, Regina found an anonymous note on her office desk. It read, in shaky handwriting, "Watch your back. Some people don't like changes around here." She felt a chill run down her spine, but she tucked the note away. She refused to be intimidated, yet the message was clear. Her actions had rattled deeply ingrained power structures. Later that week, Regina presided over a hearing involving a high-profile defendant, a local businessman accused of fraud. The case drew significant media attention, and the courtroom was packed. Regina maintained her composure, methodically going through the motions of bail and discovery. Everything proceeded smoothly until the hearing concluded. As she left the bench, a deputy approached with a grave expression. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "there's something you need to see." He handed her a small pile of photographs that had been slipped under the courtroom door. The images showed her entering and exiting the courthouse, taken at various times of day, from different angles. In one photo, she was unlocking the door to her car late at night. Another depicted her leaving a grocery store. The message was unmistakable. Someone was surveilling her. Though unsettled, Regina resolved to remain unflinching. She contacted courthouse security, filed a formal report, and requested extra patrols near her home. But fear gnawed at the edges of her confidence. She had always known stepping into a position of authority might invite pushback, but this was beyond the norm. Her mind flickered back to Halston, though she had no concrete proof he was behind it. She also considered the possibility of an unrelated threat, angry defendants, unscrupulous lawyers, or any number of people who might resent a strict judge. Meanwhile, Halston was summoning his own allies, a couple of officers who harbored grudges against perceived political correctness were open to hearing him out. They met in secret at a diner in a suburb just outside Houston, trading stories about how they felt. The justice system was coddling criminals and bowing to social pressures. Halston fanned the flames, portraying Regina as a usurper who had disrespected him in front of the entire courtroom. He left out details about how he had refused to let a defendant speak. Conveniently, he painted himself as the victim, an honest cop caught in the crossfire of an overly progressive agenda. His friends nodded, some out of genuine agreement, others out of loyalty. One man suggested they find a legal way to trip Regina up, file a complaint, maybe even dredge up her past for any questionable skeletons. Halston's eyes glinted with a mixture of desperation and cunning. It didn't take long for a rumor to surface that Regina might have ethics violations in her past. Within days, a tip arrived at the local press claiming that Judge Monroe had once engaged in questionable fundraising for a civil rights non-profit. The claim was baseless, but it forced the media to scramble, seeking comment. Regina found herself bombarded by reporters' questions on the courthouse steps. She calmly refuted the allegations, handing out documentation proving her compliance with all campaign finance and charitable guidelines. Yet, the seeds of doubt had been planted. The wheels of vengeance continued to turn. Another rumor surfaced that Regina's judicial application was rushed, that her bar exam scores had been below average. Again, a patent lie. But each time she had to address these rumors, her energy was diverted from her actual work, deciding cases and upholding justice. Days turned into a whirl of media inquiries, courtesy calls from colleagues concerned about her safety, and an internal review of Halston's conduct. The review was fairly conclusive, highlighting that the officer had obstructed due process. But Halston had friends in high places, and the final recommendation from certain administrative heads was merely a suspension with pay, a slap on the wrist. The net result, Halston felt emboldened, not humbled. His next move, in the darkest corners of his mind, was to teach Regina a lesson she would never forget. What Halston didn't anticipate was that fate, like justice, has a way of circling back with fierce retribution. In his quest to undermine Regina, he unknowingly put himself on a path that would unravel secrets from his own past, secrets that would bring about a harsh and ironic twist of karma. And so, as Regina stood her ground in the face of intimidation, the looming confrontation in her courtroom was just the prelude. A far more intricate web of deceit, revenge, and personal reckoning was about to ensnare them both. In the humid swirl of another Houston dawn, news vans parked around the courthouse like vultures, sniffing the air for scandal. The so-called judge versus cop story had become a talking point across local television and online forums. The public was hungry for details, especially once a grainy cell phone video from the day of the confrontation surfaced. It showed Officer Halston blocking Tanya Rogers from the microphone, then Regina ordering him out. Within hours, the footage went viral, and national outlets began to pick it up as an example of systemic issues in law enforcement. Regina couldn't escape the spotlight. Every day, she stepped into her chambers with fresh determination, yet always wary of what new rumor or threat might greet her. The corridors, once purely professional spaces, now felt like a maze of watchful eyes and hushed whispers. Deputies started greeting her more respectfully, calling her "Your Honor" with extra emphasis, as though publicly declaring their allegiance. Clerks came forward to discreetly share their own experiences with Halston, adding layers to the pattern of intimidation he had honed over years. Regina listened, jotted notes, and forwarded relevant details to the courthouse administration. And still, her personal life took a hit. She noticed a black SUV outside her apartment building more often than not. It never approached her, never parked too close, always at a distance, headlights off, engine sometimes idling. She tried to remain focused on her duties, but each night, as she locked the door, a pang of fear gnawed at her mind. She reminded herself that the greatest weapon against intimidation was the law she upheld. At the same time, Halston found himself in unfamiliar territory, sidelined, restricted to desk duty while the internal review concluded. His days were spent pushing paper in a back office, seething in silence. The rumor mill chattered about the possibility of further disciplinary action, especially after the viral video. He lashed out at friends who tried to console him, refused calls from senior officers who gently suggested he apologize and move on. An apology? To that woman who had undermined him so publicly. Over his dead body, in a desperate bid to regain his standing, Halston began combing through Regina's judicial records, trying to find any detail he could exploit. Late one night, while rummaging through archived files in the police database, he stumbled across something else entirely, a series of complaints about misconduct tied to a handful of arrests he had made years earlier. He'd forgotten about them, but as he skimmed the documents, the memories flooded back. Allegations that he'd used excessive force, doctored police reports, even coerced false confessions. Each time, he had managed to evade formal charges thanks to professional courtesy and the code of silence within his department. But times had changed. Reforms in the department meant the old files had been digitized, flagged for potential re-examination. And now, in an ironic twist, Halston's search for dirt on Regina led him to his own precarious past. If these old investigations were reopened, which they might be, given the public scrutiny, his entire career could collapse. A pit of dread settled in his stomach, but pride and anger still drove him forward. Maybe if he found something explosive about Regina, he could spin the narrative, shift the focus away from himself, and come out on top. He continued his obsessive search, but turned up little. Regina's record was pristine, her academic achievements solid, her legal career a series of consistent successes. In frustration, he shut down his computer, hands trembling in rage. He had stumbled onto the blueprint of his own downfall without a countermeasure. His mouth felt dry, his heartbeat accelerated, and sweat collected on his brow. He was trapped. Meanwhile, fate had another plan. Several community activists who had long suspected Halston's misconduct saw the viral video as an opportunity. They filed a petition demanding an independent review of every case Halston had been involved in, collecting signatures outside the courthouse. Public pressure mounted, with local radio stations discussing the controversies swirling around him. For years, these activists had lacked proof and public momentum. Now, they had both. Unaware of this brewing storm, Regina continued her judicial duties, meticulously hearing cases, writing opinions, and seeking to maintain impartiality. Yet, a part of her mind was consumed with the sense that a bigger confrontation with Halston loomed. She worried for her safety, but she also felt an equal measure of concern for the integrity of the judicial process. The system was supposed to protect the innocent, not shield those who abused power. By the end of the week, the courthouse was abuzz with new headlines. Officer Halston's passed under investigation. Regina heard the news from a court clerk during a recess. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Sandy, whispered that Halston's desk had been cleared, that an internal affairs unit was rummaging through his service records. Regina felt a flood of relief and apprehension. She never wished for anyone's downfall. Yet, the principle of justice demanded accountability. In that moment, Regina realized karma was no myth. Halston's attempts to sabotage her had led him to his own compromised history, and as the old adage goes, those who dig graves for others sometimes fall into them themselves. The question now was whether Halston would accept the consequences or lash out in even more destructive ways. For a brief spell, it seemed as though the tension had ebbed. Officer Brady Halston was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the departmental investigation. The black SUV that had haunted Regina's evenings vanished. The barrage of press inquiries slowed to a trickle, replaced by more pressing local news. Regina's days, once fraught with whispered rumors and suspicious stares, settled into a calmer routine. She took the bench each morning, her rulings guided by legal precedent and a moral compass finely tuned by her own life experiences. Judge Delgado, now fully retired, checked in with her occasionally over phone calls. He praised her for her professionalism and offered the occasional anecdote from his long career. His sage advice was simple: justice can be slow, but it doesn't fail forever. Keep your eyes on the law and your heart on the truth. Regina found solace in those words, especially on days when her confidence wavered. In the courthouse corridors, support for Regina began to solidify. More staff felt comfortable sharing their encounters with Halston's intimidation tactics, incidents that had been overlooked or downplayed in the past. Regina encouraged them to speak openly to investigators, ensuring the official record reflected the extent of his actions. Meanwhile, the external pressure from community groups prompted the local district attorney's office to vow a thorough examination of every questionable arrest Halston had made. It was a staggering undertaking, but it signaled a watershed moment in the quest for accountability. Still, Regina couldn't shake the feeling that something unresolved lingered. When she passed by Halston's old station near the courtroom, she half expected to see him standing there, arms folded, eyes full of contempt, a daydream or nightmare, she wasn't sure. In quieter moments, she replayed the scene of their confrontation, questioning whether she had acted too harshly or too hastily. Each time she concluded that justice demanded she do exactly what she had done. If she backed down at that moment, how many more times would voices be silenced? How many more Tanyas would be denied their right to speak? Then came the phone call that told her the calm was only temporary. Late one evening, as she prepared to leave her chambers, her cell phone buzzed. The caller ID read unknown, and she almost dismissed it. But intuition nudged her to pick up. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. A pause on the line, then a slow, raspy voice she recognized. "This is not over, Your Honor." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't need a name to identify the speaker. Officer Brady Halston's voice was etched in her memory. She steadied herself, determined not to reveal fear. "Harassing a judge off hours isn't the wisest move, Officer Halston." He gave a humorless chuckle. "You want wise moves? How about not making enemies of people who know every corner of this city?" Regina felt her pulse spike, but she held her ground. "If you're threatening me, threats—" "No," Halston snapped. "Just a courtesy call, letting you know you've kicked a hornet's nest. And you will feel the sting." The line went dead. For a moment she stood there, phone gripped so tightly her knuckles turned white. Part of her wanted to call the police immediately. Another part of her worried that any official complaint would be lost in the chaos of Halston's already open investigations. She took a deep, shaky breath. Dealing with bullies had been part of her life since grade school. She knew the importance of vigilance, and so she resolved to stay watchful, to alert security, to keep her network of allies informed. But deep down, she also braced herself. Halston wasn't one to fold easily. Over the next few days, small but unsettling incidents occurred. Someone keyed her car in the courthouse parking lot, leaving deep scratches along the doors. A suspicious man in a hooded sweatshirt lurked near her building's lobby, darting away when the doorman approached. Regina filed each incident in an official report. careful to maintain a paper trail. She refused to be driven into hiding or paranoia, yet each event chipped away at her peace of mind. Her staff grew concerned. The bailiffs offered to provide an escort when she left the courthouse. She accepted the gesture gratefully. Colleagues who had once been polite acquaintances now became protective friends, rallying around her with supportive messages and watchful eyes. Even the DA's office quietly assigned an investigator to keep tabs on any rumored plots against her. The entire system seemed to sense a rising tension, a final confrontation on the horizon. Halston, for his part, kept a low profile, no public statements, no fiery appearances, but whispers trickled in that he was meeting with a handful of ex-cops, men who had either left the force under questionable circumstances or retired with grudges of their own. What they discussed, no one could say for certain. Yet Regina suspected they were fueling each other's resentments. The city rumbled with anticipation. Would justice triumph, holding Halston accountable for past abuses? Or would corruption and intimidation find a way to claw back? Regina understood that she was not merely a character in this drama, but also its moral fulcrum. If she allowed fear to dictate her actions, the entire notion of justice in that courthouse might buckle. And so, the stage was set. Both principal actors receded from the public eye, marshalling their resolve for the inevitable reckoning. Like the hush before a thunderstorm, Houston waited. And when that final storm broke, it would wash away any illusions about who truly stood on the side of the law and who was weaponizing it for personal vendettas. In a twist of judicial scheduling, Regina Munro and Brady Halston found themselves on a collision course. The district attorney's office had decided to formally charge Halston with obstruction of justice based on the contempt of court incident and new evidence from his past cases. Summons were issued for a preliminary hearing to be held in none other than Courtroom 4B, Regina's courtroom. Court administrators tried to reassign it to avoid conflict, but the docket was already swamped, and Regina's calendar provided the earliest opening. On the morning of the hearing, a steady rain fell over Houston. Grey clouds huddled low in the sky, matching the somber mood inside the courthouse. Security was heightened. Additional deputies were stationed at every entrance. The tension in the air crackled. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras poised to capture the historic moment, a judge presiding over the hearing of an officer she once held in contempt. Regina arrived earlier than usual. She spent time in her chambers, centering herself, reviewing the charges, and reaffirming her commitment to impartiality. This was not about personal vengeance, it was about the law. She refused to let personal history with Halston color her judgment. Either the DA's case would stand on its merits, or it would not. Shortly before the hearing, Regina took the bench. Courtroom 4B was packed. Rows of reporters, activists, curious onlookers, and uniformed officers formed an unlikely tapestry of faces. The hush was palpable when Halston entered, flanked by his attorney, a stern, sharp-suited man known for defending high-profile clients. Halston, dressed in civilian clothes, kept his eyes trained on the floor. Only when he took his seat at the defendant's table did he glance up at Regina. The hatred in his gaze was a silent warning. The preliminary hearing commenced. An assistant district attorney outlined the charges, obstruction of justice stemming from the day. Halston barred a defendant from speaking, plus allegations of falsifying reports in at least 3 older cases. A key witness, a fellow officer who'd left the force, testified that Halston had bragged about planting evidence on suspects he deemed trouble. The gallery reacted with gasps, and Halston's attorney objected vigorously. Regina presided over the hearing with measured grace. She sustained valid objections, overruled the ones that lacked merit, and refrained from any outward show of bias. The DA presented evidence linking Halston's pattern of misconduct to racial discrimination. Internal emails, old testimonies, and even an audio recording surfaced pieces of a puzzle that painted a damning portrait of his abuse of power. Halston's attorney tried to discredit them, calling the claims circumstantial or claiming tampered evidence. But the weight of the documents and testimonies seemed overwhelming. At one point, Halston himself took the stand. His attorney guided him through a rehearsed narrative. He was a dedicated officer who may have made errors in judgment but never intentionally broke the law. He characterized the confrontation with Regina as a misunderstanding. He claimed he was escorting the defendant to maintain order, not denying her a chance to speak. Regina observed him carefully, eyes unreadable, letting the prosecutor handle cross-examination. An uneasy hush hung in the air as Halston tried to position himself as a misunderstood public servant. But then, the DA asked a pointed question. "Officer Halston, did you have any personal animosity toward Judge Monroe that influenced your actions on that day?" The room tensed. Halston hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Regina, then back to the DA. "I had no reason to. She was just new," he muttered. The DA pressed further. "Are you aware that multiple court staff have testified you made derogatory remarks about Judge Monroe in the days leading up to that hearing?" referring to her appointment as part of a progressive agenda to replace good officers with inexperienced hires. Halston's attorney objected. Regina allowed him to state his objection, then calmly overruled it, citing relevance to motive. Everyone in the room leaned forward, waiting for Halston's response. He swallowed hard, stammering a denial, but the damage was done. A veil had been lifted, exposing the prejudice fueling his behavior. By the close of testimony, the DA requested that Halston be held for trial. Regina convened briefly with the attorneys. Despite the personal history, the evidence was compelling and probable cause was clearly established. Regina made her ruling with the same clarity she applied to all cases. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, voice echoing in the hushed chamber, "this court finds sufficient grounds to bind Brady Halston over for trial. Bail is set at $100,000. Officer Halston will surrender his passport and remain under house arrest with electronic monitoring until trial." The gavel's final rap resounded like a thunderclap. Halston's face twisted in fury, his knuckles white on the defendant's table. He was effectively stripped of his badge, his freedom curtailed, his future uncertain. On the other side of the bench, Regina maintained her poise. Yet inside, she felt the wave of justice surge, powerful, impartial, and unstoppable. Court security led Halston away. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Regina rose from her seat, exiting through the side door. The final storm had broken, revealing truth and accountability in a public forum. For the first time since her swearing in, Regina felt the scales of justice tip in a direction that validated her faith in the system. Halston had tried to muzzle a defendant, sabotage a judge, and manipulate the law for his own ends. And now, at least for this moment, the law stood firm against him. Over the next several weeks, the case against Brady Halston became a high-profile trial that captivated Houston and beyond. The parade of witnesses was jaw-dropping. Defendants he had once arrested, fellow officers who described his heavy-handed tactics, even a forensic analyst who challenged the authenticity of some of his past reports. Day by day, Halston's carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of evidence. Public opinion turned sharply against him. Even those who initially defended Halston as a tough cop came to see how his methods had crossed legal and ethical lines. The media dubbed it a watershed moment in Houston law enforcement. Activists hailed it as long overdue justice for minority communities disproportionately affected by abusive policing. The local government, wary of further scandals, launched additional reviews of officer conduct, hoping to weed out any who shared Halston's mindset. Regina Monroe continued her duties, presiding over an array of cases unrelated to Halston's trial. Though she had initiated the contempt charge, she played no further role in his prosecution to avoid conflicts of interest. Yet the ripples of that initial confrontation permeated every corner of the legal system. Young defenders and prosecutors alike found inspiration in Regina's steadfast adherence to legal principles. Her unwavering stance sent a message: fairness and accountability were not just catchwords, they were the bedrock of justice. Halston's attorney attempted every trick in the book motions to dismiss evidence, claims of entrapment, and appeals to the court of public opinion. None found traction. A flurry of court dates ensued, each one tightening the noose around Halston's professional life. With every new revelation, the presiding judge in his trial cut deeper into his claims of innocence. Finally, in a dramatic turn, Halston took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy prison sentence for obstruction, forgery of official documents, and civil rights violations. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was once again packed. Regina, seated in the public gallery this time, watched as the judge delivered a stern rebuke. You, Officer Halston, who swore to uphold the law, chose instead to violate it repeatedly and lie to cover your tracks, the judge said, his voice steady. Your actions erode the public's trust in law enforcement. I hereby sentence you to 5 years in state prison and 10 years probation. You will never serve in law enforcement again. As Halston was led away, his eyes found Regina in the crowd. The hatred remained, but there was also a flicker of resignation, as though he finally realized he had orchestrated his own downfall. Regina held his gaze, her expression a mixture of resolve and sadness. She took no pleasure in seeing another person lose their freedom, but her commitment to justice outweighed any sympathy for his self-inflicted fate. The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond Halston's personal tragedy. The Houston Police Department instituted reforms, including mandatory bias training and stricter protocols on evidence handling. Court staff felt more emboldened to report misconduct. An environment that once harbored silent tensions began to shift toward transparency. It wasn't perfect, there were still entrenched interests and old prejudices, but a door had been opened that couldn't easily be closed. For Regina, life settled into a new rhythm. She was no longer the new judge who clashed with the cop, but a respected figure whose rulings carried the weight of intellect and integrity. Media coverage shifted to a more nuanced portrayal of her work, showcasing her fairness in complex cases and her ability to maintain empathy without compromising the rule of law. Letters from citizens poured into her office, some offering support, others sharing personal stories of injustice, hoping she could champion their cause. Late one evening, months after Halston's sentencing, Regina walked through the empty courthouse corridors. She had stayed late to finish a lengthy opinion on a civil rights case. As she passed courtroom 4B, she paused, drawn by the memory of her first historic day on the bench. The ghosts of that confrontation still lingered, the hush before Halston's defiance, the tension in the gallery, the dramatic moment when she ordered him out. Now, that same moment felt like a distant echo, replaced by the hum of an evolving system. A sense of peace enveloped her. In that vacant space, she reflected on the notion of karma. Halston had tried to silence voices he deemed unworthy. He had attempted to sabotage her authority, driven by prejudice and pride. But in the end, it was his own deeds that dragged him into the spotlight of accountability. Regina had not done anything beyond applying the law with courage. The wheels of fate turned, and their final verdict was unambiguous. Justice, when pursued rigorously, had the power to transcend prejudice. She left the courtroom, her footsteps reverberating across the polished floor. The building that once felt intimidating now seemed like a place of possibility, a testament to the battles waged in the name of fairness. And as Regina Monroe, judge of the Harris County Criminal Justice Center, stepped out into the warm Houston night, she carried the satisfaction of knowing that change, however gradual, had been set in motion. The stand she took reverberated beyond that single case, proving that one person's resolve can catalyze transformation. And so ends the dramatic journey of a cop who refused to let a black woman speak and discovered too late that the woman was the newly appointed judge determined to bring truth to light. Through courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice, Regina Monroe exposed the very corruption that tried to silence her. Her resolve ignited the courthouse, reminding us that no matter how deep prejudice runs, it can be uprooted by the steady force of law and conscience. If you found this story gripping, uplifting, or enlightening, make sure to like this video to show your support. Share it with friends, family, and anyone who believes in the transformative power of justice. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories that shine a light on the fight for equality and integrity. Your engagement fuels our passion to bring you the truth, one story at a time.